As a lifelong fan of J.R.R. in Tolkien's Middle-earth, I find myself deeply immersed in the ongoing debate about who portrays Galadriel better, Cate Blanchett in The Lord of the Rings or Morfydd Clark in The Rings of Power. And however, after much contemplation and reflection on my own journey through Middle-earth, I've come to realize that this is not a question with a straightforward answer. In Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Galadriel, portrayed by Morfydd Clark, contrasts significantly with both the Galadriel created by J.R.R., Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings series, and Cate Blanchett's interpretation from Peter Jackson's film trilogies. When the Fellowship leaves Rivendell, their initial destination is the elven sanctuary of Lothlorien. Upon arrival, they are greeted by a calm yet formidable Lady Galadriel, Cate Blanchett. Despite supporting Frodo's mission to destroy the One Ring, Galadriel chooses to stay in Lothlorien to safeguard her own realm from Sauron. To sum up, the Galadriel scene in the Lord of the Rings prequel is distinctly different from her counterpart in Amazon's Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. In the fictional world of Middle-earth during the Second Age, as depicted in the series The Rings of Power, the character Galadriel is portrayed by Morfydd Clark. Unlike her older self from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, she appears much younger. Eventually, the series takes place about 5,000 years before these events. So Galadriel is at a stage in her life that can be compared to a young adult due to their immortality. What is Galadriel like in Rings of Power? Galadriel was a hot-headed warrior in the Second Age. In the Rings of Power, Galadriel is portrayed as a youthful elf leader, harboring a sense of resentment and a fiery temperament that she often struggles to control, which contrasts sharply with the character played by Cate Blanchett in The Lord of the Rings. Unlike her title in Tolkien's mythology, where she is known as the Lady of Lothlorien, Galadriel in the Rings of Power is referred to as the commander of the Northern armies. Although this specific military leadership role isn't explicitly mentioned for Galadriel in the established lore, there are no restrictions in Tolkien's writings that would prevent her from holding such a position from the writing number slightly well. In the grand scheme of Middle-earth folklore, Galadriel's actions on the battlefield may find their place, but they certainly add a new dimension to her classic portrayal, not necessarily the one we are familiar with from The Lord of the Rings. During the epic flight of the Noldor as depicted in the Silmarillion, Galadriel was the lone female who stood for the exile from Valinor. While she is later known as the composed and balanced Lady of Lothlorien, portrayed by Cate Blanchett in The Lord of the Rings, the younger Galadriel was more defiant, bold, and driven, in a departure from the traditional portrayal of Galadriel. Morfydd Clark's interpretation in the Rings of Power series features her engaging directly in physical combat alongside other warriors, rather than relying solely on powerful spells during crucial battles. Contrary to some fans' misconceptions, this newer version of Galadriel is indeed an accurate representation of the character, as it has been adapted Tolkien's portrayal of Galadriel leaves much open to interpretation. The source material doesn't actually reveal much about Galadriel. Made changes to Tolkien's vision, even though Galadriel's persona isn't as much of a deviation as it initially seems. Morfydd Clark's Galadriel is definitely different to the iteration created by Cate Blanchett and director Peter Jackson. But both versions of the character had to build on the surprisingly small amount of information provided by J.R.R. Salt. Tolkien. Amazon still added a lot to her character, but this isn't the heresy hardcore Tolkien enthusiasts make out. In the creation of the producers enjoyed an unexpected degree of freedom, particularly in shaping Galadriel's character. Though she features prominently in Tolkien's works, Galadriel lacks the depth and development that characters like Frodo, Sam, Bilbo, or Gandalf possess. Well, there is a wealth of information about Galadriel's actions. Her personal characteristics were not extensively explored by Tolkien. Besides numerous details regarding names, timelines, and locations, very little insight into Galadriel as an individual can be found. In simpler terms, much of Galadriel's background before The Lord of the Rings is fact-based world building and historical lore, similar to the Silmarillion and other appendices that serve as the foundation for the Rings of Power. Amazon had significant creative freedom with the character, provided they adhered to the times and places Tolkien established and followed through on what he confirmed she was accountable for. Essentially, how Galadriel is portrayed in the Rings of Power falls within the realm of possibilities. Which version of Galadriel is better? Making comparisons isn't as helpful as it seems. It's not hard to see why some fans and casual viewers might want to compare Galadriel between The Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power. However, making these comparisons isn't as simple as it seems. There's several factors that make deciding which Galadriel is superior a rather pointless exercise. The older Galadriel, portrayed by Cate Blanchett, doesn't seem to embody the narrative of The Lord of the Rings of Power, as effectively as Morfydd Clark's younger version. Producer, if viewers consistently picture Galadriel as an old and distant elven queen, then the fiery young warrior portrayed by Clark might not fit right. Essentially, the Amazon series wouldn't be as successful if Galadriel were just a younger version of Blanchett's character. The show relies on Galadriel's character being driven by a chip on her shoulder and personal vendetta against Sauron, along with her youthful susceptibility to temptation, given that the Rings of Power are now coming into play. Instead, it would have been a missed opportunity if Galadriel, the sagacious and balanced elven leader, had appeared as a war-obsessed commander whose sole desire was to slay Sauron. The essence of Frodo's mission became more apparent when this composed elder refused to expose her people in Lothlorien to unacceptable danger by participating directly in the quest against Sauron. In the Rings of Power, aspects of Galadriel's character, like her attraction towards the One Ring, differ significantly from what we saw in Lord of the Rings. Although the films hinted at Galadriel being tempted by the One Ring, the response in The Rings of Power presents a unique journey for the character. In fact, the younger version of Galadriel portrayed on Amazon appears to lay the groundwork for why Miranda Otto's Galadriel was so passionate about her feelings towards the One Ring and her reluctance to touch it. It's important to note that neither interpretation can be considered superior because they each contribute distinctly to their respective tales, which are fundamentally different in